The desert wind howls across the ruins of a city that was meant to last forever. Beneath the sand lies a truth so devastating that an entire civilization tried to erase it from existence. Every carving bearing his name was chiseled away. Every monument was toppled. Every record was destroyed with a fury that bordered on desperation. Ancient Egypt wanted the world to forget this man ever lived. But some horrors are too profound to remain buried. What Akhenaten did to his own daughters wasn't just a crime. It was a corruption of the divine itself, a betrayal so complete that it shattered the very foundation of Egyptian kingship. This is the story of how absolute power transformed a father into a monster, and how 6 innocent girls became sacrifices to one man's twisted vision of godhood. It began in the golden halls of Thebes, where the now reflected sunlight like living fire. 6 daughters were born to the royal couple, each name a prayer in itself: Meritaten, Meketaten, Enkhesenaten, Neferneferuiten, Neferneferur, and Setapener. Their father, still known then as Amenhotep IV, appeared devoted to his family in ways never before depicted in Egyptian art. He was shown playing with his children, embracing them, kissing them beneath the radiant sun. These images were revolutionary. For the first time, a pharaoh wasn't portrayed as distant and godlike, but warm, human, loving. The people of Egypt looked upon these scenes and saw hope, a new kind of kingship built on affection rather than fear. But beneath that carefully crafted image, something dark was taking root. Amenhotep's devotion to the sun god Aten was deepening beyond mere faith. It was becoming obsession, fanaticism, delusion. He began to see himself not as Aten's servant, but as Aten incarnate, the only voice through which the divine could speak to humanity. That transformation would doom his daughters before they were old enough to understand what was happening to them. When Amenhotep made his decision to abandon Thebes and build a new capital from nothing, he severed more than geography. He cut his family off from the stabilizing influence of Egypt's ancient priesthood, from tradition, from reality itself. The new city, Akhetaten, rose from the desert like a fever dream, populated only by true believers who worshiped the pharaoh as a living god. Within those sun-baked walls, the normal rules of Egyptian society began to dissolve. The daughters became central to this new religious cult. Artists were commanded to depict them not as children, but as celestial beings, radiant extensions of their father's divinity. As the years passed, their individuality vanished from the record. They were no longer portrayed with distinct personalities or playful expressions. Instead, they appeared as identical symbols orbiting their father's overwhelming presence, their lives no longer their own. To understand what happened next, we must understand the crisis Akhenaten created for himself. When he abolished the old gods and dismantled their temples, he destroyed the very system that had legitimized pharaohs for thousands of years. Without the blessing of the ancient priesthood, his divine authority became desperately fragile. He needed a new source of legitimacy, a way to prove his bloodline carried the essence of divinity itself. And so he turned to a solution so obscene that even hardened courtiers struggled to comprehend it. He would use his daughters, his own flesh and blood, to rebuild the concept of sacred kingship around himself alone. The eldest, Meritaten, was the first to be transformed. She began appearing in rituals that had always belonged to her mother, Queen Nefertiti. At first, observers told themselves it was symbolic, perhaps preparation for an advantageous political marriage. But the art told a different story. Meritaten was shown standing beside her father in poses that left no room for misinterpretation. She wore the regalia of a queen. She performed the sacred rites of a royal consort. Those who understood Egyptian iconography knew exactly what it meant. The unthinkable had become reality. Akhenaten had claimed his own daughter as his wife. The manipulation required to achieve this was methodical and monstrous. For years, he had conditioned his children to see him not as a man, but as a god made flesh. To disobey him wasn't rebellion. It was heresy against the divine order itself. Every hymn they sang, every ritual they performed, every carved wall they passed reinforced this reality. Their father was the sun, and they existed only to reflect his light. In such a world, resistance became psychologically impossible. The palace servants began to whisper about what they witnessed during those years, rituals that twisted into something unrecognizable. Processions where the pharaoh's daughters stood silent and hollow-eyed, moving like sleepwalkers through ceremonies that defiled everything Egypt had once held sacred. Foreign ambassadors who visited Akhenaten returned home with disturbed, confused reports. Even the pharaoh's most devoted followers began to harbor private doubts. Something inside the royal palace had gone catastrophically wrong. When Queen Nefertiti disappeared from the historical record, whether through death, exile, or sheer despair, any hope of protection for the girls vanished with her. They were left alone with their father and the delusion that consumed him. Akhenaten's elevation was celebrated with gleaming ceremonies and hymns praising what they called a divine union. But beneath the spectacle was wrought. The young woman, barely a teenager, withdrew into herself. Witnesses described her moving through the palace like a ghost, her childhood laughter extinguished, her eyes reflecting nothing but emptiness. And then the pattern repeated. When Akhenaten failed to produce the male heir Akhenaten craved, his gaze turned to his second daughter, Akhenaten. She was scarcely 13 when she began appearing beside her father in the regalia of queenship. Once again, the sculptors were ordered to immortalize the arrangement in stone. Once again, courtiers averted their eyes as sacred traditions were violated in the name of divinity. The court physicians began recording strange ailments afflicting the royal women, careful euphemisms that barely concealed the truth. These girls were breaking under the weight of trauma that had no name in their language. But what happened to Akhenaten would shock even those who thought they had witnessed the worst. The palace fell silent one day in a way that felt different from the usual oppressive quiet. Courtiers whispered of sudden illness, of a tragedy behind closed doors. But the carved reliefs tell the real story. Archaeologists discovered a scene depicting a young woman on a birthing bed, surrounded by mourners, a nurse cradling a tiny infant. Akhenaten had died in childbirth, and the father of her child was almost certainly Akhenaten himself. Even in an age familiar with brutality, this sent shockwaves through the kingdom. The whispers grew louder. The gods had turned their faces away. Egypt itself was being punished for cosmic disorder, for violations so profound they threatened the balance of the universe. But Akhenaten did not stop. He did not repent. He simply turned his attention to the next daughter. The surviving princesses watched from the shadows, understanding with absolute clarity what awaited them. Their childhood paradise had transformed into a labyrinth of fear with no exit. They learned that in their father's world, love meant possession, faith meant submission, and family meant sacrifice. The pattern would repeat with mechanical precision. Each daughter elevated when the previous one failed to provide a son, each ceremony more desperate than the last. Each girl's light slowly extinguished beneath the weight of her father's obsession. If you're still watching this, it means you understand that some historical horrors need to be remembered, no matter how painful. This channel is dedicated to uncovering the truths that civilizations tried to bury. If that matters to you, if bearing witness to history's darkest chapters feels important, then please subscribe, because there are more stories like this waiting to be told. Stories that challenge everything we think we know about the ancient world. Akhenaten was next, a child barely 13. Her name meant she lives forgotten, and in the cruelest irony, that prophecy consumed her entirely. She stood beside her father in public ceremonies, draped in symbols of queenship, tutored relentlessly in theology until she could recite that her father's will was the will of the divine. The conditioning was complete. The spirited, curious child vanished, replaced by a hollow vessel shaped to fit her father's blasphemous vision. The palace physicians documented it all in careful, neutral language, afflictions of the womb, weaknesses of spirit, ailments of the mind. Beneath those clinical terms lay the brutal reality. These girls bore physical and psychological scars from systematic abuse so profound their bodies and minds were breaking down. Outside the palace walls, Egypt was collapsing. Provinces rebelled, vassal kings withheld tribute. foreign enemies tested borders that had once been impenetrable. Akhenaten, lost in his private madness, ignored it all. The mortal world held no interest for a man who believed himself the sun incarnate. Within Akhenaten, the atmosphere became suffocating. Statues of the royal family no longer inspired devotion but dread, their carved eyes seeming to watch from every corner. Those who still worked in the palace moved with mechanical obedience, their faces expressionless masks worn for survival. The daughters were vanishing into themselves. Servants described them as ghosts, wandering the gardens in silence, speaking to no one, staring at the horizon as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. When one failed to give Akhenaten his desperately needed son, another would be elevated to take her place. The same rituals performed, the same hymns sung, the same priests forced to bless abominations they could no longer rationalize. Some of these priests broke completely, raving that Aten's light had turned to consuming fire. Others simply disappeared, likely executed for refusing to participate. The youngest girls suffered in ways that palace attendants could neither name nor heal. Said a penner stopped speaking above a whisper. Nefernefer would strike mirrors as if her own reflection were an enemy. At night, servants found the sisters sleeping in tight clusters, hands linked in the darkness, having learned that the only protection left to them was to be small, quiet, invisible. They had become children hiding from their own father, the man who should have been their greatest protector. Akhenaten himself was deteriorating. His body grew gaunt, his eyes burned with feverish intensity. He paced the halls alone at night, muttering to invisible beings, claiming Aten whispered to him through beams of light. Servants described him as a man consumed by his own divinity, his mind fracturing under the weight of delusions that had grown too heavy even for a pharaoh to bear. What had begun as religious revolution had curdled into a theology of coercion, where love had been translated into obedience, obedience into worship, and worship into demands only a father could make and only a monster would fulfill. The end came not with dramatic violence, but with exhaustion. By year 17 of his reign, even Akhenaten's most loyal followers were fleeing the city. The walls of Akhenaten were closing in. The daughters who survived their father's reign carried scars that would never heal. Akhenaten would later marry Tutankhamun, escaping her father's grasp only to find herself trapped in another political arrangement. The younger sisters disappeared from the record entirely, their fates lost to the deliberate erasure that followed. When Akhenaten finally died, Egypt moved with unprecedented speed to obliterate his memory. His name was chiseled from monuments, his city was abandoned to the desert. His religious revolution was dismantled stone by stone. The priests he had exiled returned to restore the old gods with a vengeance. Everything he had built was systematically destroyed. But the trauma he inflicted on his daughters, that particular horror, could never be fully erased. It whispers to us still from the carved reliefs, from the empty eyes of the princesses depicted in stone, from the archaeological evidence of lives destroyed in the name of divine purpose. In the comments below, tell me, how do we remember figures like Akhenaten? Do we study them as warnings, or does remembering them give their cruelty a kind of immortality they don't deserve? This is one of history's most painful questions, and I want to hear what you think. The desert wind still blows across the ruins of Akhenaten, carrying sand over the crumbled palaces where 6 daughters once lived. Their father tried to build eternity and instead created a horror so complete that an entire civilization worked to forget it ever happened. But history, as always, refuses to let us look away. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones that hurt to tell, because if we forget what happened in those sun-baked halls, if we let the sand bury these truths completely, then we risk forgetting what absolute power can do to the human soul. And that, perhaps, would be the greatest tragedy of all.